Habakkuk. We remember in chapter 1 of Habakkuk, it began with a sob. We saw Habakkuk really bumming out over the fact that the nation of Judah, God's people, a nation that professed to follow God, was completely drowning in sin. And Habakkuk cries out to God. He says, God, how long are you going to allow this to take place? I mean, there's violence, there's garbage going on every which way. And we are a group of people that say we are followers of God. Then God responded in chapter 1, remember. After he says, why does God permit evil? Then God tells him, well, hang on. In your day, I'm going to judge my people, but I'm going to use a nation that is even more ungodly than you all are. You profess to know God and are acting ungodly. I'm going to raise up a group of people that don't profess to know me. They're more wicked than you are. You think you're bad. You think you're violent. I'm going to bring someone worse than you, and I'm going to discipline you with them. And Habakkuk sees that, and he goes, well, God, why are you going to do that? Why are you going to use a nation that's even worse than us? And God explains. It starts with a sob, a cry of Habakkuk. It ends with the song we'll see tonight. In chapter 2 of Habakkuk, verse 1, Habakkuk, after hearing God's, what he's going to do, and then says, why are you going to use a nation worse than us and all? Habakkuk then says, well, I'm going to stand my watch. We said he is determined to hear. We looked at Ezekiel chapter 20, or Jeremiah chapter 29 last week, remember. We saw that if we really, truly seek the Lord, he'll speak. We saw the first thing he did is he was determined to hear from God. Then he says, I'm going to go up on the tower, on the rampart. I'm going to get alone by myself. We talked about the importance of having a quiet place, a quiet time, and a quiet heart. That if we want to really understand what God is doing in our life, we have to determine, God, I'm going to hear from you, and I'm not going to quit until I hear from you. And I'm going to have a quiet place, a quiet time, and a quiet heart. And then he said, and I'm going to watch to see what God's going to say to me in chapter 2, verse 1. He had determination, he had isolation, and he had expectation. He says, I'm going to be here. I'm going to wait for God to speak to me. I'm going to hear it. Then we saw, as we continued last week, we remember in chapter 1, verse 1, there was a burden. It said the burden which the prophet Habakkuk saw. It means masa in the Hebrews. The Hebrew word, it means a heavy judgment. The heavy judgment that God announced on Judah and on the Babylonians. Here in chapter 2, verse 2, the Lord says to him, he says, write the vision. We saw the burden. Now we see the vision in chapter 2. And then we saw, remember in chapter 2, we saw where the Lord gives Habakkuk this taunting rap, this taunting song, this taunting poem, remember we talked about. And in this taunt song against Babylon, because of their wickedness, we saw it was because of their intimidation, because of their intemperance, because of their iniquity, because of their indignity, because of their idolatry. And because of what Babylon had done, God was not only going to discipline Babylon, he was going to take them out. Because they had attributed their strength and their military power to their own ability, not recognizing that they were an instrument in the hand of God to discipline his children. So chapters 1 and 2, we see this conversation and this taunt song and everything. And now as we get into tonight's study, chapter 3, as we finish up the book of Habakkuk, we are going to see, it says in verse 1, a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, on Shigionoth. Wow, that's a word. A prayer of Habakkuk. Chapter 1, the first part, we saw the burden. Chapter 2, we saw the vision. Now we see Habakkuk's response. Remember, he said in chapter 2, verse 1 there, I'm going to stand my watch, I'm going to set myself on the rampart and watch to see what he will say to me. And then he says, and what I will answer when I am corrected. I'm going to wait on God until he speaks to me and see what I'm going to respond. Here's his response in chapter 3. It's a prayer. It's a prayer of Habakkuk, the prophet, on Shigionoth, there it is. Crazy word, but what it means is really interesting. A lot of the margins in the Bible say meaning unknown. But it is a term that is used when you're worshiping. And it's this swaying back and forth, not only like you see at the Western Wall when they're praying, not only like this, but also like this, also like this. It is a movement of joy. So he says, God, why in the world aren't you doing something? God says, I got this. Here's what I'm going to do. And God, why would you use someone more wicked than us to do this to us? And God says, they're going down too. I'm just going to discipline my kids, but I got you. And now the sobbing turns to a song, to joy. That's what we're going to be looking at here in chapter 3. As we go through chapter 3, when we're finished, we're going to go back and look at it again from a different perspective. So here we go. Chapter 3. What's he going to say? Here's what he's going to say in verse 2. He says, O Lord, I have heard your speech. I heard what you just said in chapters 1 and 2 here. And I freaked out. I was afraid. Man, you're going to discipline us that harshly with the Babylonians? You're going to take them out? O Lord, revive your work in the midst of the years. And in the midst of the years, make it known. Notice what he's saying. God, you're going to do something that crazy, that great, that powerful, that mighty. You're going to take us out of Jerusalem. You're going to bring us into captivity. You're going to destroy the most powerful nation in the world. Oh God, do it in my time. That's the meaning of the Hebrew phrase there, in the midst of the years. It means in my lifetime. Notice what God said in chapter 1, verse 5. Look among the nations and watch. Be utterly freaked out. For I'm going to work a work in your days, which you would not believe, though it were told you. That's how God started. He says, watch, I'm going to do it in your days, and you're not going to believe it. Even if I tell you, you're not going to believe what I'm going to do. And now he says, oh Lord, do it, but do it in the midst of the years. Do it in my lifetime. God, do it. He prays only 2 petitions in his prayer. One is for the mighty power, the mighty working of God to be evident. God, work in power, work in might. God, show your might. And secondly, he says, in this wrath, remember mercy. God, show your might and show your mercy. 2 M's. That's the whole gist of chapter 3. God, when you judge, show your might. God, when you judge, show your mercy. That is the key when we look at the judgment of God on his own people and on those people who are not his people, on Babylon. So verse 2 becomes the theme of chapter 3. It is the key of chapter 3, might and mercy of God. Now he says something interesting here. He says, God came from Teman, the Holy One. Remember we talked about the Holy One last week, or 2 weeks ago, when we referred to God as he was talking about the Holy One in chapter 1, verse 12 there. He uses that phrase again. He says, God came from Teman, the Holy One, speaking of God, from Mount Paran, or Paran. Teman is just east of Edom. Those of you that are an Old Testament survey, you got your map in your head. Now you know right where Edom is. It's just to the east of Edom, just south of the Dead Sea, just north of the Gulf of Aqaba. Those who went to Israel, just north of Elat, right there. There's Teman. Now Paran is a little bit more to the west. We want to take a look at this Mount Paran for a quick second. We're going to go to the book of Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. It's towards the back of Deuteronomy. We want to go to Deuteronomy chapter 33. And in Deuteronomy chapter 33, it tells us in verse 1, now this is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. So it is at the end of the life of Moses. He's getting ready to go up to Mount Nebo and to die and be buried up in Mount Nebo there. He's led the children of Israel for 40 years through the wilderness. And now he blesses them and he says this, the Lord came from Sinai. Remember on Mount Sinai when God came down and met with Moses. And dawned on them from Seir. He shone forth, notice, from Mount Paran, or Paran. The very same thing that Habakkuk is saying here when he says the Holy One came from Mount Paran. So there when God met with Moses, notice what he says. And the Lord came with 10,000s of saints, referring to the angels. It is Jewish tradition that angels were involved in giving of the law. From his right hand came a firing law for them. Yes, he loves the people. All his saints are in your hand. They sit down at your feet. Everyone receives your words. Moses commanded a law for us, a heritage of the congregation of Jacob. And he was king in Jeshurun when the leaders of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together. And he goes on and gives the history of Israel. Well, now Habakkuk, hundreds of years later, as he speaks this prayer back to God, he says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. And then you see the word Selah there. When you say amen, it means so be it. When you see Selah, it basically means think about it. But it's also a phrase used in music, and it means just chill. Just listen. So this is a prayer that is going to be set to song. It's a song that is sung in the temple. Take a look at the last verse of chapter 3. At the very end of it, it says, to the chief musician with my stringed instrument. Those of you that were in Old Testament survey, you remember we studied the Psalms. They had those transcriptions, those little headings in our Bible at the beginning of each psalm, remember? There's a little writing before the psalm, and then the psalm, and then there's a little writing, and then the psalm. Well, for the last 40 years or so, it's believed that those little things, to whoever it is, remember, to the chief musician, a song of David, all that, is really a postscript. It's at the end of the psalm, not at the beginning. So even though it might say Psalm 47, it's got these things, it really then belongs to Psalm 46. They usually wrote that at the end, and one of the reasons for that understanding is Habakkuk chapter 3. Because at the end of this prayer song, notice what it says, to the chief musician with my stringed instruments. So this is something that was sung in temple worship, and it was to be sung with a lot of movement. It was very excited. It's talking about God, and he says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran, and he's got movement going on. There's that chicken off thing going on, and he's all fired up and now gets quiet. And then typically what they do after a Selah is they'd either raise it a pitch or raise it in volume. They tell Walter, turn it up, and after the Selah, he turned it up a little bit more. And it just keeps building as we go. So here's the Selah. Now we go to the next group of words, or the next stanza, if you will. He says, his glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. His glory covered the heavens. And it's a picture coming from the east. This we're going to see in a minute, he follows Moses' description of God's presence like a big thunderstorm like you've never seen. And it comes moving in. And the glory of God covers all the heavens. It's this huge thing. And Moses talked about the lightnings and the thunderings and the earthquake, and things were going crazy. It's this big old storm coming on in. And he says his glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. It's the reality of God's presence. Here it comes. His brightness was like the light. He had rays flashing from his hand. It's almost a picture, if you will, of this light coming from the presence of God that is so strong. These rays are flashing from his hand. We can't help but remember Exodus 34 when Moses came down from being with God. Remember, his face radiated, same word. His face, he had light radiating, flashing, if you will, from his face, from the presence of God. Here it is, he says, and there in this brilliant light coming out of this storm, the presence of God coming in from Mount Paran. And there his power was hidden. Before him went pestilence, the plagues, and fever followed at his feet. The word fever is literally bolts of fire, or burning heat, or the ultimate hot flash. If you've ever had a hot flash, this is a serious hot flash. God comes through, the hot flash. We see the power of God in the midst of this light, in the midst of all this. It's almost man, God, your light, your warmth, it's awesome. Can't help it when we think of the sun. I love it when it's cool in here and the sun comes down, starts setting, and the sun hits through the windows, and it's just this warm sun. Since I've shaved my head, I'm losing more heat, I've noticed. And it's like, oh, the sun is just warm. I love it. I love it. I was reading Psalm 92. Keith said he's going to read Psalm 92 tonight, and I just took a quick glance at it, and the lights are off, but the sun was setting, and it was just perfect. The sun came right on my Bible, like, ooh, this is great. I could see it. The warmth of the sun, the light of the sun is fantastic, you know. And because of its warmth and its light, sometimes we forget the power of the sun. Do you realize if we were just like 27 miles closer to the sun, we'd be toast? And if we go right into the sun, we're way toast. We wouldn't even be toast. We wouldn't even be cinder. We'd just be gone. The power of the sun is so crazy, sometimes we forget that because of the warmth and the light. And that's kind of the picture that he's giving us here as he talks about this very poetically, very picturesquely in Hebrew. He says God is coming. And man, he's huge. He's covered the earth. And he's coming. We've got the light and we've got all this going on, but his power was hidden there. Before him were the plagues, after him, the toast, if you will. The power of God. Sometimes we forget about the power of God in his judgment. And now we understand why Habakkuk said, oh Lord, your might, yes, but please God, mercy in your judgment. We'll all be toast. He says, God, he stood and he measured the earth. He looked and he startled the nations. The nations freaked out. The everlasting mountains, those mountains that have been there forever and a day. Those mountains, the Sandias, if you will. They've been there a long time, long time. Those mountains, the everlasting mountains, they were scattered. The perpetual hills, the hills that are always there, they bowed. They bowed. They're gone. His ways are everlasting. He says, I saw the tents of Cushan in the affliction. The curtains of the land of Midian trembled. The tents, the flimsy housing of the nomads, the curtains, literally the tent hangings of the people. What are they when the mountains that have been there forever are freaking out and disappearing? What is a tent of a man? I find it interesting that Paul talks about our bodies being this tent. Who are we to stand up in the presence of God when God judges a nation? And he brings that together here in verse 6 and 7. Then 8 through 11, he shows God's actions in nature. He says, oh Lord, are you displeased? Were you displeased with the rivers? Is that why the rivers got you mad? Was your anger against the streams? Was your wrath against the sea that you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation? And there's an implied no there. No, God's not mad at nature. It's because of sin, man. It had nothing to do with nature. As much as we try to blame nature for our issues, no, it's the sin is what arouses the wrath of God. Your bow is made quite ready. It's pulled from its sheath, if you will. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. You divided the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and they freaked out. They trembled. Literally, they writhed like a childbirth pain type of thing. The overflowing of the water passed by. The floods, the deep uttered its voice. It roared. As God moves, the ocean, the seas are going up and down. And lifted his hands on high. You can hear the seas. You can hear the oceans. The waves are going crazy. Tsunamis like you've never seen before. Mountains shaking, going crazy. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. We can't help but think of when in the book of Joshua God held the sun still. At the light of your arrows they went. At the shining of your glittering spear. So God worked in the midst of nature, and he oftentimes does that. He uses nature to discipline his own, to bring our remembrance. I remember back in the 90s, there was flooding going on, and one of the main floods that year was in Grand Forks, North Dakota. The Red River flooded, and that was very special to me, because that's where my dad's from. He's from Grand Forks. My Uncle Gary, he died last year, remember. Uncle Gary bought a home, he and Aunt Korean, right at the base of the dam there in Grand Forks. And they're sitting in their home, and all of a sudden the Red River rose more than they thought, and they came with emergency vehicles and said, get out now, this dam is going to overflow now, you got to go grab. No, you don't get to grab anything, go. And they just left, grabbed their dog and a few pictures, and they were out of there. And sure enough, the dam broke, the flood, and their house was underwater, just like that. And if you remember that year, there was flooding up and down the Mississippi. It was crazy, a crazy, crazy time. And I remember at that time, there were Christians who were saying, God is getting our attention. And since then, we've seen the hurricanes, we've seen all the stuff just in our own country. And people have said, well, God is using this to get us to turn to him. Wake up. God oftentimes uses nature to get us to talk to him. Well, I remember after that flood and all, I was watching my favorite late night show, The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. And I just thought Jay Leno was funny because I loved his chin. And there it was. And he had a monologue after that. And he said, I hear the conservative Christians are saying that this is God trying to get the attention of America by flooding the central part where there's nobody out there except a few cows and a few farmers. And I remember him mocking it and saying, what's God going to do tomorrow? Hey, let's go over and tip over some cows? What? You really think God's going to do something like that? Seriously? And he made some joke, and I just remember going, you are no longer my favorite guy. You are publicly mocking God. That is like really stupid. It wasn't 2 weeks later. Not 2 weeks later. He came on at Tonight Show. Some of you might remember it. No makeup, looking disheveled, looking freaked out. An earthquake had struck Southern California. Of all things, it hit the studio where the Tonight Show was being filmed. And there was going to be no Tonight Show that night because of the damage of the earthquake. And he was there just for a second. Well, because of the earthquake here, and we're not going to have a Tonight Show, and we'll get a chance as soon as possible. We'll come back and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, Jay Leno, shut up. Just shut up. How dare you mock God? You fool. Because my Bible tells me a fool says in his heart there's no God. What a fool. God will oftentimes use nature to get attention of his kids. Then in verse 12 through 15, we see God not working through the nature, but God working among the nations. He says, you marched through the land in indignation, you trampled the nations in anger, you went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You struck the head from the house of the wicked, laying bare from foundation to neck. You took their head off, if you will. You destroyed these nations. You thrust through with his own arrows the head of his villages. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor in secret. You walked through the sea with your horses, through the heap of great waters. Egypt, the Red Sea, Mount Sinai, the Jordan River, conquering Canaan. He says, look what God has done. He has stopped the sun. He has opened up the Red Sea. He has parted the Jordan River. He's helped us conquer all of the promised land. That's our God. He's a powerful God. And if our God can do that, he can easily destroy the most powerful nation in the world if and when he wants to, because he's God. You see, there's no nation that can stand up to God. And Babylon can thumb their nose in God's face, but if God says it's time for you to go down, then you go down. There's no nation that's ever been, ever will be, or is even now that is too big for God to discipline or take out. Then in verse 16, when I heard, my body trembled. I freaked out. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled in myself. Oh, that I might rest in the day of trouble. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. They're coming. They're coming. Verses 17 to the end of the chapter here, we see now, though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines. Well, that's a problem in the Middle East. If you don't have the figs, if you don't have the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, whoa, no olive oil either. We're talking famine here. And the fields yield no food, whoa, no prosperity. Though the flock may be cut off from the fold, that's an issue. And there be no herd in the stalls, that's a huge issue. There is famine, there's no food, there's no animals, there is no prosperity at all. Then he says, yet I will rejoice. The word rejoice literally means right there to jump up and down. Remember this dude here the other night when we had that little mini concert on Sunday night? And there was this dude right where you were standing, Anthony. Remember that? Yes. How many of you know James Montgomery? Remember James? He used to do that over there. He sits right over there where David is, kind of. And he'll stand up during worship. He'll just do this. And there he goes. There goes James. He's jumping up and down. You're like, come on, James, come on. You're too old to be jumping up and down. That literally is rejoicing. Isn't that something? And that's what he says right here. Remember this guy? Remember he was jumping up and down right there. How many noticed that? How many thought that's kind of whacked? How many thought, I wish I had the freedom to do that? How many thought I wish I had the freedom to do that? I thought that. I said, I wish I had the freedom to do that. There's not a chance in the world I'll ever do that. I'm just not going to do that. You're not going to ever see me go like this. That's just not me. I just don't do that because I'm too into myself. What would you think of me if I did that? I'm not going to do this. You think I'm crazy. I don't even think I'm crazy. No one knows I'm crazy except my wife. And I've got an image of, I'm not going to rejoice in God. Why would I do that? That'd be kind of dumb. We think I would have. James, stand up for a second. What's it look like? Let's see. Here we go. That's rejoicing. Oh, James is rejoicing. Nice. That's okay to rejoice. It's okay. You see, the real weirdo was not him. It was us looking at him. We're the weirdos. I can guarantee you God did not look at him and say, man, I wish you wouldn't rejoice so much. Come on now. You know how we're just crazy that way. That's how we are, you know. But it says here, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I'm going to jump up and down in the Lord, he says. Now it gets even crazier. I will joy in the God of my salvation. How do you joy in the God of my salvation? You're not going to believe this. When I looked this up, I just started laughing. You know what that word means in the Hebrew? I will joy. You know what that word joy means right there? You're not going to believe it. It means turning around. This guy was actually rejoicing, enjoying in the Lord. To me, it looked weird. I'll just be honest with you, because it was so foreign to me. But as I read this, I go, he was right, I was wrong. Man, I hate when that happens. But remember him doing that? He's a big old dude, right in the front row, jumping up and down, spinning around. I'm going, oh, buddy, come on. How dare you rejoice and joy in the Lord? This is church, man. What's the matter with you? Come on now. Isn't that something? Any idea what's going to be going on in here in the future? It's going to be kind of, at any rate, there it is. But he says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. Isn't that something? You see, the inner peace of God, the joy of God, the rejoicing in God, is not dependent on outward prosperity. Isn't that something? Only in America do we think that you got to have more to have joy. Anthony, you've been to Bulgaria, what, twice now? Have they talked to you about how many weeks of vacation they have?
No, but I've seen it when you get.
A lot, huh? They start off minimum 5 weeks, minimum. That's when you start. And after you're there for a while, you're getting up to 2 to 3 months. You just get vacation. And yet you go there, they have no high blood pressure, they're chill. Families are good, marriages are good, they have what to eat, they got a place to stay, they drive their car, they're all happy. You know how much overtime they get? 0. Talking to Ludmil, last time Connie and I were there, his son Risto, that's what he gets. He gets like 5 or 6 weeks vacation. I'm thinking, well, how can you even live? Where do you live? I rent an apartment. You got a car? Yeah, nice car. So what do you do? My favorite thing, my friends, we fly over to Germany and Italy and France. We follow our favorite football team. We go all the time. Football, soccer, they call it football. Soccer, but they call it football. And they travel Europe checking out their team. 5 weeks vacation, nice car, work 6 to 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and they're fine. Someone has 3 weeks of vacation here, we think they're sloths. If you don't work at least 10 hours a day, what's wrong with you? How can you expect to have the nice home and 2 cars and all the toys and buttons and whistles if you don't do that? Isn't that crazy? But inner peace has nothing to do with outer prosperity. He says, even if I got nothing, the garage is empty, there is no furniture, there's no house, yet I'm going to rejoice. I'm making a decision. I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation, because the Lord God is my strength. He will make my feet like deer's feet, those mountain deer and the mountain goats both, known for their strength, their sure-footedness, and their speed. He says, I'm going to be strong, I'm not going to fall, and I'm going to keep up with where the Lord's taken me. Then he says something interesting, and he will make me walk on my high hills. I've got my own personal high hill, and he's going to make sure I walk there. He's going to make sure I don't fall. He's going to strengthen me there. He's going to get me through there at the right time. And all the time, they have this. They're jumping up and down. They're spinning round and round. They're swaying. They're fired up for God. Now, I grew up in a Lutheran church. We had one person that sang in the church, Bob Shireen. I think he got saved, didn't he? Is that what happened to him? Yeah. This is before I did, and before you did. And this guy comes into the Lutheran church, this big old dude. In the Lutheran church I grew up in, a small little town, maybe 50 people in the church. I don't even know. 60 maybe? I don't know. Maybe 70? I don't know. People in the church. We all sat in the back. That's why I always joke when you guys are in the back, because that's where I sat. We all sat in the back because we were Lutheran. That's where the Lutherans sat, in the back. So we'd sit in the back. Mrs. Nelson would play the organ. She'd be back there playing the organ. She would sing a little bit. No one else would, so we'd open our hymnals and we'd just look at them. And then this Bob Shireen came in with his big booming voice, and he started praising God. And I can remember with my friends, I must have been 7th, 8th grade at that point. I was old enough now to mock. And we would say, who does he think he is? What is he doing? Doesn't he know this is a church? What is he doing singing? He would sing loud, just blared out there. He was doing that Shinnigaroth thing. He just into it. Would you shut up? I mean, worshiping God in church. Who ever heard such a thing? You know. It's the most amazing thing. Well, at any rate, that's Habakkuk 3. And that's interesting historically, but prophetically, it's amazing. And that's where I want to end, because it's amazing. Because now we're going to go back and look at chapter 3 from a different perspective, but it'll be very quick. We've got all the meat. We're going to just read through it and let you see it. But before we do, I want you to turn to Isaiah chapter 63, because in Isaiah 63, 100 years earlier, God gave Isaiah this prophecy, and it's pretty cool. Today, Cleston and I were studying in the book of Revelation. We hit the last half of Revelation. By the way, those of you that were in Old Testament survey, since Old Testament survey graduation, Cleston has done the entire New Testament survey. I know you're not surprised because you know him. He did the whole survey in a month. But, so at the end of this service, Cleston's going to get up and do what he did with the Old Testament. He's going to do it with the New Testament. No, I just play. But probably could. But at any rate, we finished up Revelation today. And it's pretty interesting in light of Isaiah 63. Check it out. Isaiah writes, he says, who is this who comes from Edom? Remember we said Teman was just to the west of Edom right there? Well, here's Edom. And Isaiah writes, who is this who comes from Edom with dyed garments from Basra, that same area right by Teman? This one who is glorious in his apparel, traveling in the greatness of his strength? Then there's the answer. The answer is, I who speak in righteousness, mighty to save. There's the Messiah. Say, it's me, the Messiah. Then he asks the question, well, why is your apparel red and your garments like one who treads in the winepress? The answer, I've trodden the winepress alone, and from the peoples no one is with me. For I have trodden them in my anger and trampled them in my fury. Their blood is sprinkled upon my garments. I have stained all my robes. For the day of vengeance is in my heart, and the year of my redeemed has come. I looked, but there was no one to help, and I wondered that there was no one to uphold. Therefore my own arm brought salvation for me. In my own fury it sustained me. I have trodden down the peoples in my anger, made them drunk in my fury, and brought down their strength to the earth. Notice, I will mention the loving kindness of the Lord and the praises of the Lord according to all that the Lord has bestowed on us, and the great goodness toward the houses of Israel, which he has bestowed on them according to his mercies. Remember, Habakkuk cried out for God's might and his mercy. And here it seems that he had Isaiah 63. I'm not saying in his mind, but God definitely gave him a prayer that ties in with Isaiah 63. He says, according to the multitude of his loving kindnesses. For he said, surely they are my people, children who not lie. So he became their Savior. In all their affliction he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. In his love and his pity he redeemed them. He bore them and carried them all the days of old. But they rebelled and grieved his Holy Spirit. He turned himself against them. As an enemy he fought against them. Then he remembered the days of old, Moses and his people, saying, where is he who brought them up out of the sea with the shepherd of his flock? Where is he who put his Holy Spirit within them, who led them by the right hand of Moses with his glorious arm, dividing the water before them, to make for himself an everlasting name, who led them through the deep as a horse in the wilderness, that they might not stumble. As a beast goes down in the valley, the Spirit of the Lord caused him to rest. So you lead your people to make yourself a glorious name. Isaiah 63, we go back to Habakkuk chapter 3 now. And now as we go back to Habakkuk chapter 3, starting in verse 3, we want to look at this as a theophany. We want to look at this as a typology. We want to look at this as pointing to the second coming of Jesus. And take a look at verse 3. God came from Teman, the same area as Basra. The Holy One from Mount Paran, that same area. The Babylonians came from the north. God is now coming from the south. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. Think Revelation as we read through this now. His brightness was like the light, and he had rays flashing from his hand, and there his power was hidden. Before him went pestilence, and fever followed at his feet. He stood and measured the earth, and looked and startled the nations, and the everlasting mountains were scattered, the perpetual hills bowed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan afflicted, and the curtains of the land of Midian trembled. O Lord, were you displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against the sea? That you rode on your horses, your chariots of salvation, your bow was made quite ready. Oaths were sworn over your arrows. You divided the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and trembled. The overflowing of the water passed by. The deep uttered its voice. We're seeing this geographical upheaval of the earth as the coming of the Lord. And lifted his hands on high. The sun and moon stood still in their habitation. In the heavens, we see things going on in the heavens. At the light of your arrows they went. The shining of your glittering spear. You marched through the land in indignation. You trampled the nations in anger. You went forth for the salvation of your people. For salvation with your anointed. That word anointed, there's Mishach. It's the Messiah, the Christ. You struck the head from the house of the wicked by laying bare from foundation to neck. So there's that Selah. You thrust through with his own arrows ahead of its villages. They came out like a whirlwind to scatter me. Their rejoicing was like feasting on the poor in secret. You walked through the sea with your horses, through the heap of great waters. When I heard, my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones. I trembled in myself, that I might rest in the day of trouble. We remember the tribulation was oftentimes called for the Jews the day of Jacob's trouble, interestingly enough. When he comes up to the people, he will invade them with his troops. Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, we remember in the horses of the tribulation. There's the white horse of the false peace. There's the red horse of war, followed by the black horse of the famine and death. The famine. So here we have the famine showing up. Yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. The Lord is my strength. He'll make my feet like deer's feet. He'll make me walk on my high hills. We see God covering his own. Specifically, I believe the 144,000, but he covers his own. Even in the midst of his judgment, God remembers with mercy. So we see the might of God and the mercy of God dealing with the Babylonians. We see it dealing in the end times, as we study the book of Revelation. Some interesting things. In closing now, we just look at the prophets, two prophets in the Old Testament who were struggling with the will of God. One was Jonah, remember, and here's Habakkuk. Both struggling. Jonah, really, you want to save the Ninevites? Habakkuk, really, you're going to use the Babylonians to discipline us, really? When Jonah was confronted with the will of God, remember, he ran from God. Habakkuk runs to God. I'm going to go in the rampart. I'm going to sit and be still and hear from God. Jonah, the book ends. He's in foolishness. He's all bent out of shape, worried about that little gourd tree, remember, outside of Nineveh. Habakkuk, he ends in faith. He learned to trust God. Jonah, he learned his lesson in a fish. Habakkuk learned in a tower, alone with God. Where do you want to learn? In a fish or in a tower alone with God? Well, I don't want that quiet time. I don't want to be in a tower. That's all right. God's got a fish with your name on it. You can learn in a fish. I want to encourage you, choose the tower. Choose the quiet place, the quiet time. Quiet your heart. See what God has for you. Habakkuk's problems were much bigger than Jonah's. Yet Jonah ran. The problem with a fish, the fish shows up with storms. It's cramped. It's stinky. It's dark. Rotten place to learn, but we'll learn. I want to encourage you, run to the tower. Expect to hear from the Lord. Be determined to hear from the Lord. Isolate yourself with the Lord. Watch what will happen. got a load on our life right now. The way that we get out from under the load that seems to be smothering us, the way out from under the load is to get right under the Lord. And that happens in the tower times, in the quiet times. So, leaving tonight, just look at your own life. No one knows but you and God. Are we having those quiet times with the Lord? Are we bluffing it? Are we bluffing it? We're going to have our quiet times. We're going to have our quiet times looking at Facebook. That's quiet times. We don't say much. We just kind of sit there. We can have quiet times with the TV. You ever notice how much talking a person does when you watch TV? I'm going to do this for an hour just so we get the point. That's what we do with the TV, for crying out loud. We have quiet times. We just sit there. And then we say, but I don't have time to get alone with the Lord. So I want to encourage you, just what's going on in our own life individually. Don't forget to have time with the Lord. Get lined up with his will and enjoy all that God has for you. We have a great God. So Habakkuk ends like that. God, why don't you do something with our nation? I'm doing something with the nation. You just don't see it yet. I'm preparing a nation worse than you, more ungodly than you guys are. And I'm going to discipline you hard, and then I'm going to destroy them. God, how can you let someone worse than us do that to us? I thought we're your people because I love you. Okay. Mercy, God, mercy. And then the prayer. I'm just going to trust God. I'm going to love God. I'm going to rejoice with God. I'm going to joy in God. I'm going to jump up and down with God. I'm going to sway back and forth with God. I'm going to turn around with God. I'm just going to love God. I'm just going to worship God. I'm going to trust him because he's going to get me through this very difficult time because he's my God. That's Habakkuk. Next week, Zephaniah. He's a prince. He's a great-great-great-grandson of a king. And he's also a prophet. We'll look at his book starting next week as we continue through the minor prophets. After Zephaniah, we have Haggai. We've already done Haggai in our Ezra study. The next book is Zechariah. We've already done Zechariah in our Ezra study. So after Zephaniah, we go to Malachi, and then we've covered all 12 minor prophets. So we have 7 chapters left, 7 weeks left. Tito is doing chapter 4 of Daniel. So we'll finish up the Daniel study about the same time the minor prophets wrap up. Be pretty sweet. Sunday night, Tito's on chapter 4. So make plans to come and learn more about Daniel. Some good stuff. God bless you guys. Let's stand up. And Kurt, there you are. Send us on out of here.